Sometimes when you're driving down the road all by yourself, you begin to hear a voice that tells you need to look around, pay attention. Maybe something isn't quite right. That voice is me. It's the voice of Gord. Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back. Quick intro for you. Got a great discussion here with a young lady named Clarissa Hawes, whose name you might recognize from FreightWaves, and prior to that she wrote for LandLine. Clarissa's a independent investigative journalist, and she specializes in looking into malfeasance in the trucking industry. She's been really good at digging up the dirt on a number of negative phenomenon and scams and bad actors in the business. I've been following her work for a long time. I'm going to be incorporating some of it into the book. As a matter of fact, she's great and a wonderful, wonderful resource to cite. And really nice lady. We had a nice chat here for a little over an hour. And she tells us a little bit of her story and her background in journalism and the sort of art and craft of all of that stuff. And we dig into some of the issues of the day in trucking. And I think you guys are going to really enjoy this. Clarissa is now freelancing it. You can find her. Her email address will be in the show notes. I'll share links to some of her previous work. As you know, I'm writing a book on the fate of the American trucker in 2025. There'll be a link there for that. As always, questions, comments, suggestions, corrections, and hate mail are always welcomed and strongly encouraged. Gordilox@protonmail.com. If you haven't already, head on over to my Substack and smash that subscribe button. autonomoustruckers.substack.com. Share this around, tell your friends, buy the book when it comes out. If you're of means and you can afford it, upgrade to a paid subscription. Help me keep the lights on. Otherwise, enjoy this wonderful discussion and have yourself a good summer. All right, good day, everybody. Welcome back to another fantastic episode of the Voice of Gord podcast. I'm Gord, and this is my voice. The other voice you're about to hear today is someone I've been trying to get on the show now for some time. And, sometimes these things take time. And I finally got her nailed down. And if you've been around the world of freight or trucking and you are a reader, you'll recognize her name, if not her voice. But the other voice you're going to hear today is an investigative journalist who has worked for FreightWaves and LandLine Magazine, who are the official publication of OOIDA, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. So please welcome to the show, Ms. Clarissa Hawes.
Thank you for having me on today. It's been a minute since we last chatted.
Yeah, and then, we met at Future Freight Festival in Chattanooga about a year and a half ago now.
Yes, and to have a lot to discuss.
Yeah.
There's always a lot to discuss in the industry.
There sure is. I was reviewing before we started here, the tab at FreightWaves. I punched in your name for all the articles you've written for them over the years. I mean, some of them I sort of have off by heart and memory now, but it's just like screens and screens and screens. Like I don't know how long you worked for FreightWaves, but there's hundreds, if not thousands, of articles there with your name on them.
About 6 years I was there.
Right.
So, yes, I've covered the gamut, for about 18 years. My sole focus has been on the transportation industry. So, it's been to see the evolution till now. It's and then some of the issues that we were talking about, that I wrote about in 2006, are still some of the issues that we're still talking about today. So, it's you always hope that change is going to come, and I'm waiting for that on a lot of issues. But
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, before we get rolling about those issues, give us maybe a little brief bio, um, where you live, where you're from, and then when and how you got into writing about trucking.
sure, I live outside of Kansas City, Missouri, and um, have lived here for 27 years, and I started writing for OOIDA LandLine Magazine back in 2006. And I had a fantastic editor in chief, Sandy Zonker, who is since retired, who took me under her wing and for a few months just let me listen, like because, I admitted that, I had a journalism background, but really had no trucking knowledge. And she took a chance on me. And for the first, I just like was the news clerk, and I just, incoming calls, about from truckers with stories or possible stories about situations that they were experiencing all over, the country and in Canada as well. And so then I started kind of, she gave me a little bit more freedom to kind of ferret out which ones I was interested in, which ones I thought were something. Some I pass along, but I always like, I work alone. I've worked alone for so long that I would just dive on my own, dig and dive. And I'd be like, there's something here. You will have to help me, kind of expand on what I know, but I know there's a story here. And that's been my whole career in investigative reporting, is that I wanted to know more and I needed to know why, something happened. And so, a lot of my stories aren't just one-off, stories. I like, I want to follow it. I want, to bring awareness. I want, a lot of times want to prevent, things from from happening again. But it's, definitely, a frustrating process for sure.
You mentioned that you had a background in journalism before joining Landline. Who are you writing for before?
Well, I had been writing for, I had taken a few years off. I'd been writing for like an accounting firm, accounting and tax proposals. And then I worked for a small weekly newspaper, um, for, and did I covered city council, school board meetings. I mean, features, fairs and everything. I covered it all. So,
That's what
and
they would call, I think that beat, there's a term for that, like cub reporter sort of thing.
yeah, yeah, and general assignment, yes. So I did it all, and I learned a lot, over that time.
Right. Yeah. No, I kind of fell into it. I mean, I don't do deep dive investigative journalism like you do. I'm just an opinion merchant, but I try and be well researched into it, which is why you're here.
Yeah,
I greatly appreciate a lot of your work. There's a bunch of really good female journalists in the trucking space. You know, dudes tend to just like spout off and get mad about stuff, but I appreciate your curiosity and wanting to know why. And as you mentioned, you don't just like do one story and leave it, like you keep reporting on it. And some of the trends and ongoing issues in trucking, I think you've covered extremely well. And without your reporting, we probably wouldn't know very much about some of them, actually. So thanks for coming, and let's get into some of those stories. Um,
sure.
so a lot of your articles at FreightWaves are under their bankruptcies and layoffs file,
Right.
and um, it's a lot of like this is no disrespect to you, but it's a lot of bad news.
Absolutely.
Trucking companies going bankrupt, running out of money, uh, equipment getting repossessed, bad financing deals, scammers, brokers not paying people, freight getting stolen. You did a number of articles about what I would call indentured servitude, where migrant groups are being abused by certain operators in the United States trucking market. So it's just this sort of like litany of bad vibes, and nobody likes that. Everybody wants it to get fixed, as you mentioned. But what is it about this industry, to your mind, being A, an outsider, and B, now having written on it for the better part of 2 decades? Um, what do you notice? What are the trends? Why is it this the way it is? I mean, that's a huge open-ended question, but where amongst all of those bad vibes would be a good place for you to start?
I know they used to call me the bad news bearer, as my nickname because, it seemed like, all of the bad news, kind of fell under my beat, over the years. But, you know, as I mentioned before, some of the issues that I've reported on, from double brokering, from, temporary work visa issues. And I've been covering the same, you know, issues for, since 2006. There's always, you know, bad players in the industry, as we know. And from the beginning of, time, there's always been a corporation or a company that wants to make money, but they don't want to have to pay their people, as much because they want to keep the majority of the profits for themselves. And that means shortcuts and not explaining, how the industry works. And, unfortunately, a lot of drivers who have come to the US to drive truck, that's been the case, that they've fallen prey to, misinformation or, big promises, and, to be sponsored to come here, that there were a lot of conditions put on, you mentioned earlier in some of my reporting, that drivers were forced, to, and I think a lot of it came from not understanding how this is the way it's done. If you are coming from a different um country, and somebody, and somebody sponsors you, and you come to the US, and then they train you, you think that's how it's done, like, and for a lot of people at first, they think, wow, I'm making more money a month than I made in a whole year, where I'm from. So this is the American dream. And unfortunately, there's always a, in a lot of cases, predatory situations where the drivers are forced to operate illegally, and and it catches up to them. Sometimes they take the fall, and then it kind of, and then others, you think, oh, this is the way to operate, and then start their own company that kind of follows a similar model. So it's, it happens in every country including the US, where that this occurs.
Right. So you start writing for Landline in 2006. And you did mention that some of these issues are ongoing. There's always going to be greed. There's always going to be scam artists. It's kind of part of the human condition, as Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil passes through every human heart. And so I don't think we're ever going to solve all of these problems, but we can mitigate them. And I'm just curious, uh, how far into your reporting, starting in '06, did you start picking up on these trends? Like let's stick with that one, with the sort of abuse of work visas and the abuse of people coming to the United States. Like, was there a particular time you started noticing that happening more, or has that been ongoing since '06?
And that actually, uh, you know, was occurring way before I even started, investigating projects. But, it, in investigating these these situations, the frustrating part is understanding the dynamic of local, county, state, federal, you know government entities involvement in trying to um solve this or eliminate it. And in my experience in covering it, on a local level, if you're talking about, fraud or people reporting being, you know, on abuse, and maybe their visas being, or their, in some cases, their work, their families were living in housing that these companies owned. So their families were there, their visas were being held by the company as well. And, and everything. So it was like, you'll own your soul to the company store, that kind of that is that, if you don't push the limits, even though you at some point you realize that you can't drive 21 hours a day, and you can't, it, but yet your family is living in housing that's owned by a carrier. So would you want to see your wife and small children on the streets, in the cold, and have no money? Or, it's like this. And so at all levels, it seems like, or everybody wants to push, it onto someone else, in a different agency. And then, some agencies say, hey, we got bigger problems than this, like,
As far as correcting
compared
this
to,
stuff?
as far as, yes, as far as correcting, it's like, everybody is like, well, this is, international, crime, and, there's way bigger problems going on. And, in some, it just takes so long for, investigations to start, even at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. It's like by the time, they're looking into a situation, they've already moved on to a different level of, if they know there's something, in the works, they've already moved on to a different layer of, how to, you know, do business. And, and so it's, at the local level, it's really hard. They always say, well, have you called your, local, but, officials, but a lot of times they don't know how to investigate these. And, in some cases, the FBI never will confirm if they're looking into a situation or not. They'll just, it'll always be, thank you, thank you for the awareness. We'll let you know, or we can't comment on, an investigation if there is one. And so sometimes you don't even find out that your work or what you've sent off has made it, to
Wow.
um and and made it to their ears, that they're listening. So it's such a widespread problem, and all levels of government and agencies need to work together, and there isn't a lot of communications at some point.
Right. So let's say someone, you find some driver who is clearly not from the United States, or not native, or maybe showed up yesterday, whatever their situation is. If if they come to you with a problem, or they come to anybody with a problem and say, hey, I think these guys are ripping me off or abusing me, or maybe my work visa is dodgy or something wrong with it. Um, that jurisdictional issue you mentioned, right? So FBI, then there's U.S. Customs and Border Protection, then there's like, how many different bureaucracies would be involved in a sort of case of like abuse of migrants and or abuse of work visas, and or a company that was clearly breaking the law and employing these people?
That's a good question. They're countless, like, um, but, definitely, it depends on, you know, in some cases where, um, you know, some government agencies only give out a certain number of visas a year. And in recent work visas, for non-agricultural, and in some cases, they've extended that limit because there's such a need for in rural areas and everything that for these drivers that they need them to work. So there's very limited, in some of these areas where drivers are running, there isn't a lot of law enforcement, so it and then there's the fear too, if their families are in the country and they are here, you know in 2019, 2020, when there was kind of a movement against having immigration and supporting work visas, you know drivers were told to come on a tourist visa, and that they would figure it out, that the carrier would figure it out once they got here. And so that was became another problem for a lot of drivers as well, is that they believe that, and there were attorneys that were working in advertisements and things, saying, telling them that this was true, if you're reading your local media and it's published and ads are there, you think, oh, this is real. And so some came on these tourist visas and then went to work for carriers thinking that they were going to get their temporary H-2B visa, which didn't happen. And so when their time expired, then, and they still didn't have their work visa, it was like, were they going to be put in, camps? Were they going to be separated from their families if they were deported, or situations like that? So it became, where some were sounding the alarm, to certain people, but it didn't, like, it was like, whose problem is this, immigration? Is this, F, FMCSA? Is this the FBI? Is it, Interpol? Who is, like, looking at it? And it just kind of became this, everybody passing
The buck,
passing it
yeah.
on to someone else.
We've seen this in another recent sort of fight. There's these gentlemen I've been working with in Arkansas who are trying to pass legislation there to. They saw this problem, right? They see that the feds aren't doing anything, agencies competing with each other are saying it's not our problem, and then various people getting in accidents and uh, suppression of rates and like increased competition from outside carriers and people not from the United States. So they tried to craft this legislation in Arkansas to say, look, if you're in Arkansas, you can't be here on a tourist visa. If we catch you driving a commercial vehicle on a tourist visa, you're being placed out of service. If we catch you in Arkansas not complying with the English proficiency requirements, we're placing you out of service and having the truck towed because the feds aren't doing their job. And then the Arkansas Trucking Association comes along and tries to punk them and pass their own legislation, which was sort of mealy mouth worded, not quite the same. And then when they were arguing about it, the lady from the Arkansas Trucking Association said, this is the feds' issue. But then if you go and we talked to the FMCSA at MATS this year about it, and then they said, well, these requirements for CDLs are on the state. It's like, well, no, the commercial driver's license is a federally regulated thing because it's interstate commerce, right? And the feds set the rules for that. But this new lawyer at the FMCSA, maybe he misspoke, maybe he didn't understand the question, was trying to kick it back to the states. And then this woman from the Arkansas Trucking Association is saying, no, it's going back to the feds. So then the problem just keeps happening because nobody wants to deal with it.
Right. But I would say that and I don't want this, I mean, I think that a lot of, just like our ancestors all wanted to come to, at the time, the US was the land of opportunity, it was like to start over, this was the such the dream was to to start over here. And in some cases, um, they've been preyed upon by, people you know, from their own, countries that, have said to them, hey, like I think in one story I did, I found out that a truck driver in Eastern Europe made like $3,000 a year and, $3,700 a year or something like that. And then, if you're being promised, hey, you can make that in 1 month or, but then, like who wouldn't want to,
Oh,
change
sure.
their circumstances?
Sure, absolutely. The
So I don't think
incentives
it's
there. Yeah.
I don't think I definitely don't want it to be a racial, like I'm just saying that a lot of people, it's like where, I mean, if you come from a country where you have very little, and who doesn't want better for their families and, to have the dream, to and then and then you come here, you find out it's not what you expected, but yet you've, sold everything you've, and everything you've owned is here. Your family is are living in housing that is, you know sometimes owned or, by, the company, or that you're leasing equipment,
Right. Yeah, no,
from.
that company store model, that's a really good way of putting it. But I mean, America almost had revolutions over stuff like that, right? Like you'll remember the sort of Blair Mountain miners strike in West Virginia and other coal mining towns and the original sort of steel mills. This model where like everyone's just a servant to these huge corporations, we're supposed to have gotten past that, right? And I think I think the trucking industry, because of its sort of distributed nature and because of all of the competing enforcement agencies who then get caught up with one another or pass the buck off on one another, nobody's sort of minding, like paying attention to this return of this model, right? Like, I don't think anyone wants to say, well, there should be like zero immigration. I mean, well, some people might say that, but like, if this is going to be done, if we're going to do this, we should do it properly, where these people aren't getting abused, they're getting appropriate training first, right? I think this is the whole
Right.
problem with English: is all of the signs are in English, all of the documentation you need to fill out, pre-trip inspections, dealing with the cops, dealing with DMV, crossing the border. Everything you deal with is in English. All your weather reports. You're driving down the highway. There was a news story from this guy in North Carolina. You remember the big hurricane storms and I-40 got washed away. So this dude
Right.
comes along, he's driving down I-40, completely misses all the signs and drives right into the construction zone where they're trying to rebuild I-40 and gets stuck there. So the construction crews call the cops. The cops come along and are saying to the driver, like, what are you doing here? And the guy didn't speak any English. He just kept pointing, GPS, GPS, GPS. He had no idea that I-40 was gone, that like a hurricane had happened 2 weeks previously, couldn't read the signs, couldn't do anything. I feel bad for the guy because like someone put him in a truck not knowing any English to take advantage of his labor. Like, we can't have
Right,
that.
but what do you think about if a U.S. driver was, like employed by another country? How proficient would
Well, that never
most Americans
that's a good
be?
that's a good point. That's a good point because that never happens. All immigration is only ever in one direction. They come here. Nobody here ever goes out, right? If you're a truck driver, working class people in the West are stuck here because this is it. This is the best place, highest income, so everyone comes here. There is nowhere else for working class people in the West to go to improve things. This is it. That's why everyone's coming here. So like, one of the things find me a guy that looks like me in a check shirt that moves to India and rolls the truck over at the same rate that happens in Canada all the time. So like, again, I'm not trying to blame them folks. It's just that the model, if people are going to move here, it should be done properly so that they don't end up crashing trucks all the time because they don't know how to drive. The training standards are terrible. You should know this, right? 20 years reporting on the trucking industry. The why are there still CDL schools that will give you a CDL in like 3 weeks? How is this possible?
I've covered that.
Yeah,
you know,
tell me.
it's over and over again. And some it's, it's by law enforcement, themselves, like where there's, money to be made, and they see a revenue stream. And so it's like, hey, let's, we'll pass you, or they're enticed to pass. And I'm not saying this in every state, but in some, I'd have to go back through some of my articles, where they either work for a government agency. In California, we've seen that.
Yes,
I
I've seen
think
that.
there
Yep.
was one in Massachusetts. I think there was another one that where it was, and I don't know the status of one of them, but were so we'll say allegations that, you know, it was kind of pay to play. If you needed someone on a job and you needed a driver, and you saw that, like, hey, uh, I could use a little extra cash, not thinking of the bigger picture of safer roads, and you know their families being on the roads with some drivers that have not had any safety training. Like, you're just thinking, oh, this will get me, caught up on whatever I need caught up. They look at it from that small picture instead of setting this driver, you know, on the road to potentially impact, you know, families, and harm.
In your coverage, in your writing and in your investigations of the like training stuff, right? So we have examples of corruption or people, pay to play to get a CDL, pass this school. Do you, I'm actually legitimately curious about this because I am highly interested in licensure reform, how truck drivers get their licenses, regardless of where they're from. That's irrelevant. But in actually getting a license, I don't believe training standards are high enough, and I believe the barrier to entry to get a CDL is too low. So, in your 20 years of reporting on the industry, have you seen any movements by anybody to try and reform the system, and what have you found in looking into that?
I think there's been efforts made toward it, but it's like, it's it's getting a consensus from all of the safety groups to FMCSA to, the states, and the facilities there as well. So it's like having it conform all to the same, rules and regs. It 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 never happens, it seems. You know that you know that that occurs. And in my cover or experience is that everybody believes roads need to be safe. It's just, the the amount of, training and qualification, road experience, and how much that can be done from a trainer. Or, I always go back to the owner operators that I met when I worked at LandLine. And they were kind of on the tail ends of their career, and they were, all of them were like farm, you know they came from a ag background, and they're like, yeah, my dad, he had a screwdriver, and if I ground a gear, he whacked me, on the knuckles. It was like, and don't make you never I never made that mistake again. And then it'd be like, when I was doing this, if I, you know merged or whatever on something, and I did it wrong, oh whack, I never made that mistake again because it hurt. But you physically can't do that to people that you're training. And the time spent in cab, is very limited,
Well,
and
this is
with
it,
people
right? You're talking about these guys who came from agricultural backgrounds.
and women, a lot of women I know too are
Sure.
baddies, absolutely.
Yeah, well, the,
um
the 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 point being is that they grew up around tractors and heavy equipment, and drove farm carts and did stuff on the farm before they went out and got on the road. So they already had an idea of like the physics of operating heavy equipment, and they were sort of already leaned towards driving. And then they had like their dad or their uncles to teach them. So there was a sort of informal graduated training program that you don't get if you're from Haiti and you show up in Florida yesterday and you go to some truck driving school and 3 weeks later you get kicked out the door with a CDL. That person, that driver that took the 3 week CDL course, regardless of where they're from, that is not the same driver as someone that grew up on a farm and has been around equipment their entire life, right? And this is the
but
problem with
it's
the CDL, is that
right.
in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of large swaths of the trucking industry, which I'm sure you would agree with me, in the eyes of the bean counters and spreadsheet brain morons, those two people are exactly the same, and they are not, right? As far
They're
as
calculating their risks of an incident or a casualty, and it's all about maybe one in, yes. And I'm definitely not an accountant, but I think it's all in assessing their risk, and like what's the likelihood that you know a driver would this would happen to. But I think more are becoming you know savvy to it, but it's still the solvable, it's the unsolvable, which I wish it was solvable question is, truck drivers should be the safest on the roads, and no matter you know what, it's like the common factor is, but if you're forced to you know drive tired, if you're taught, hey, you're out of hours, let's call somebody, let's we'll get that worked out. But then your family, is you're not getting paid, and your family is facing being kicked out in the winter, and you have no money, and you're not getting paid until that load is delivered, you know and that you're that you need a in a lot of case in some cases it's you're operating without a CDL, or you're told you don't need a CDL for it used to be a lot of in auto hauling and things like that. It's like, oh, if you're under a certain weight, you don't need that. But you know they realized that they were of the certain gross weight that they did need, they should have had a CDL. And so that was another way, that it was kind of skirted, that, oh, you don't need all this training if you're just hauling a car, or, one truck, or, a couple. But then you realize, oh, in US, the amount of vehicles I'm hauling, I need to have a CDL. And so,
yeah, it's not like
I
driving a car. Yeah, that whole idea. I remember the piece you were talking about. You wrote involving some folks that were, uh, if I remember correctly, this company store indentured servitude arrangement, and they were pulling wedge trailers with like 3 or 4 cars on them. And yeah, that's not the same as driving a car, right? Like people think, oh, I'm getting in a pickup, and you see this with like domestic folks too, right? Like retirees pulling an RV. They've never driven something that big before, but like, oh, under the law, all I need is my car license. Well, it's not like driving a car, right?
It's like me trying to back a trailer up into a boat, like into a boat ramp. It's like it should never happen for me. Like I should never be. But like where, yeah, yes, I should not be in that.
So
But
getting back to the safety question and your investigative work, insurance companies, they have a role to play in this. And insurance costs are through the roof. There's all tons of these nuclear verdicts and people getting in collisions and dying and lawsuits, and it's just rampant, as you know. Have you ever interviewed any of the actuarial people, like the real number crunchers behind insurance companies? And do they, to your knowledge, when they investigate a driver involved in a collision, do they look into, are they only ever looking at like their CDL experience? Like how many years were you driving? Where was the truck driving school? Do they consider anything else about you? Like, hey, I grew up on a farm and this person grew up on a farm and they had like X number of years of experience driving a tractor, or maybe they were like working on heavy equipment in a different career before they transitioned to trucking. Maybe they were in forestry. Like, do the insurance nerds take any of this non-trucking experience into account, or are they just looking like strictly at CDLs?
I have dealt with more on the actuarial side as far as in or even on the insurance side is more in the fraud realm than I have on the casualties, on accidents side. I've talked to more insurance carriers, like involved in investigating fraud than I have, mainly just because a lot of insurance companies will not speak about an investigation, and especially involving their company or client. I hear from attorneys on behalf of like wrongful death, you know attorney, that are involved in that, and and what they're seeing as far as experience where it's like they're a driver has a trainer. The trainer is in the sleeper, and the trainee is is driving, and has no one because in a few hours that trainer is going to have to take over and drive, and
Yeah,
so
that model is
it's
ridiculous. I want that made illegal yesterday.
yes.
That team, this idea that you put two people in a truck together and they're expected to run 24 hours, yet the person who's the trainee is going to learn anything while the trainer is technically supposed to be sleeping. And then there's the issue of um, mixed gender, where a number of companies would put like a man and a woman together who are strangers in a truck, and it's a very small space, and then human nature happens or abuse happens, and
And a lot of times it's, yeah, assault, and where in some cases where the female drivers have been sexually assaulted and have been dumped at a truck stop, and
yeah, that's terrible. Oh,
the companies have known, and the companies knew of their, in some cases, of their criminal background before hiring them, because they were desperate for drivers, or in some cases their records had been sealed. um but and there is a backlog of a lot of female, a lot of carriers now want female drivers to train other females, but it's there's fewer female trainers than there are males, and so a lot of trainees are waiting for someone to train them, and uh, so there, that hasn't been figured out as well.
on that note, I'm glad you brought that up. Why are they waiting? Okay, so maybe there's not enough female trainers. I don't think that would matter as much if they weren't expected to share the truck at night. One of the problems with the American trucking industry, and because I've been privileged enough to go and live and drive in New Zealand, and I'm from Canada, and I was brought into trucking in a family owned business that the people were intelligent and they did things correctly. They don't teach you by throwing you off the deep end and sending you OTR. I did,
two and a half years working local before I ever did any over the road stuff. And this idea, whether or not it's male, female, whatever, that you put people on the road and train them that way instead of like having them work local and go home every night. Like there's a whole bunch of stress involved in this job that comes with being away from home, being away from your community and your family and your friends, like these social stressors. And you're also trying to figure out how to operate an 80,000 pound vehicle in territory you've never been to or may have no idea about with a total stranger. And if you're a woman, it
Right.
might be some dude who you think is fucking creepy, or maybe is a creep or has a record of assault. Like this whole model is dumb. Like it should not be taking place. And I want to tie that to another thing you said is this idea we can't get drivers. You and I both know that the driver shortage narrative is total and utter BS, right?
Right.
I've seen numbers there's been various studies, right? So in 2019, the American Trucking Association, loathsome beep, 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 they are, admitted that they said, oh, we know that there's 10 million CDLs out there active. Some friends of mine at a now defunct organization called CDL Drivers Unlimited paid a bunch of interns to request info from state DMVs. And this was in 2021. They came up with like 8.8 million, right? These guys at CDL Drivers Unlimited, CDLAs, just CDLA for pulling trailers, they found there was like 5 or 6 million of them, 5.5 or 6 million CDLs. There are only 2.2 to 2.5 million truck driving jobs in the country at any given time, right? That require a CDLA.
Right.
Yet there could be between 6 and 10 million of them out there. That tells you that there's not a shortage. That tells you that we have a retention problem, right? So, in your 20 years of reporting on all this stuff, how much do you think that this retention problem, driver shortage narrative thing ties into all the other stuff? The fraud, the assault of female trainees, the bringing in of foreigners and abusing them, the indentured servitude programs, the stolen loads, all of this other stuff you've reported on. Like, give me your opinion on how much of that is based on this stupidity that we think we don't have enough drivers.
Oh, that's a very loaded question with a lot of
I know.
moving parts
I know.
there.
I
And
ask a lot. I'm so sorry.
oh, okay. Well, yes, we know there are a lot of, yeah, millions of CDL holders and some, like, I've covered over the years stories where, some went through training schools from some of the mega carriers at the time, and were like brought in, like went through the training program and then, it was like, oh, by the way, we don't have any company trucks available, but we have some trucks that you could lease or and you could be your own business person and have your dream of being and so it's like, oh, so they're like, heck yeah, I want to be my own boss, and then not knowing all of the financial parts of it. So I think being burned there, where you don't know that you're on the hook for everything and except and not really knowing the business, being fresh out of um CDL school, I mean, forces some, it's like, hey, I'm not doing that again. And then in some cases it's where it's, I think, the big failures are promised home time, and in instances where it's my son's graduation or my daughter's getting married and or things like that, that it's like, and then you are promised this, and then you're forced to sit on a load and not able to make big life things like that, I think is a component where a lot of drivers are going local. It's like, and the where it used to be like a sacrifice to be away from your families, and maybe it's like the fathers were gone and they were coming home every 2 weeks, and things like that. And that whole model has changed where, this generation is very progressive, and, dads and moms, we're all working together, to bring up the families. And that requires more home time, I think. But, and there's still those that, yeah, are preyed upon where, it's, they, they think they're getting, gonna make all this money and be very, you know, and some of them, they depend on money to send back to their home countries, and things like that. And that falls, it's like when, and it's a humbling experience when what you are, told that you're going to make and what you actually make, vary. And so there's a lot of people that are, are leaving the industry because it's not, what it once was, where.
What you just brought up there too, I think is interesting, is the sort of, I don't want to necessarily say false, but the sort of promises in the marketing they use to try and attract new drivers to the industry. They always say, like, if you read it and you're careful, you could make up to. You could.
Yes.
It's always like a propositional thing. It's not a guarantee, right? You go to a trucking company, if you're somebody that doesn't know anything about trucking, and you say, how much am I going to be paid an hour? When am I getting home? You never get a clear answer, because most companies that do OTR don't pay by the hour, and they refuse to make any promises about your home time unless they're like a specific carrier that's running specific lanes or commodities. And they're not all bad. Like, I think I should interject here. You're the bad news bear in trucking, but most good trucking there's a lot of good trucking companies out there that don't have these problems. They don't have freight fraud. They have been around a long time. They can smell dodgy brokers and dodgy carriers a mile away. They've got the processes in place to avoid that. They've got good contracts. They look after their people. There's good legacy carriers around who know what they're doing, treat their people well, and it's a good job.
Right.
Unfortunately, our industry is so big that there's still a lot of room for bad actors.
I would say that. And, in covering some carriers over the years, you know, I, I think of, drivers that have been killed or died, on the road as well. And, some of the larger carriers that you might not, that have the resources to, to bring, their drivers home, don't, because it's not in the contract that they do. It's up to the families, basically to make sure that their loved ones, who are killed on the road, either, in a crash or, in COVID. There was a lot of drivers that passed away in their cab, in their sleeper berths or whatever. It wasn't on them to make sure that because financially it wasn't, they picked up the load right away. If it was a hot load or, refrigerated load, they got the load, but then, the driver was, left, and for the family to kind of find resources. And I'm not saying that in every case, but in some situations it did occur.
In some situations, you're saying a driver would die out on the road in their truck, and then the company would come get the load, make sure the load got delivered, and then just leave the body somewhere.
Yes. Like once the coroner picked up the body, it would go to the morgue, and it was up to the family to,
But
pay.
but they found another driver and the load still got delivered.
Yes.
But they left the family on the hook for getting the body.
Yes.
Man, if I ever found a trucking company owner that did that, Yeah, I can't say
You'd
anymore. I'll get
be
in trouble.
surprised. You would be really surprised at,
That's incredible to me. That's just truly incredible.
and not a plug for anybody, but truckersfinalmile.com. They do, like, and it's a lot of people that are pitching in their own money, to do this. And, and a lot of cases, and they could, it's, I do know of some of the company names, and it's surprising, but, it's not my place, but they, some of the smaller companies are the best, like these are their family members. They do the best by them. And but it's like, some of the larger carriers, they're just a number, so there's no, you know face to the number really, other than it was a crash. Could have been their fault. It likely wasn't their fault. Or during COVID, when they were, kind of being praised for doing this heroic job of, hauling the nation's freight, who caught COVID and died. And
Oh
then
yeah. Oh man, don't get me started about the COVID stuff. Yeah, the whole idea that we were the most essential of essential workers for a little while, and then yeah, then the government can just flood the zone with more people and drive everybody's wages down, and then the Canadian government treated us all like terrorists, and all of the stuff that's happened since then, and just the utter disaster that the industry finds itself in right in this very minute. I'm I better stop. I'm gonna get in trouble. Yeah, I've a very, very low opinion of the oh, we love our essential workers one minute, and then the next minute nobody cares anymore, you know?
it's just like the supply chain, like now we're refocused on, all the issues going on with, the supply chain. And it just like with in the pandemic, that was priority. We're going to fix all the things that need fixing, in the supply chain, so that goods, that everybody had the goods that they need. And then, now it's we find ourselves, in some cases where, um there's going to be layoffs. And I think UPS, announced 20,000 layoffs. And so it's like, we don't realize how fragile it is until we're in some kind of either, pandemic or natural disaster, or kind of things that are going on recently. So it's kind of, how it all comes back. You don't realize how important the supply chain is until, we're in crisis. And then it's, we need to do something about this. But we thought we did something about it the last time. We still haven't
Well,
fixed it.
sometimes the things they try and do make it worse, which is the problem.
I agree. There's been some doozies, like,
So, another question I had for you. In the stories you've written about, specifically with, again, getting back to the issue of recent arrivals and migrants coming to America and either being abused by whoever company store model, there's this problem with the backdooring into electronic logging devices, right? So 2017, we get the ELD mandate. All trucks over model year 2000 or engine year in 2000 have to have an ELD in them. Fine. But we see this issue with certain ELD software having these back doors, and then dispatchers coming in from behind the scenes to change stuff and then allow the people to exceed their hours of service. And then we have these company store models where people are afraid to quit or say anything. And there's a whole meme on this on FreightX, right? Like strong solo Sergey, the Russian or Ukrainian truck driver that just goes nonstop. He does team loads all by himself. Well, that's made possible by this backdooring. What have you found in your investigations about this ELD backdooring, and has there been anything done about it? And what's your opinion on all that?
Well, I think the US, FMCSA, when they rolled out their self-certification process, in some cases, what I found is that ELD providers, you know, made sure that what they submitted to FMCSA, fit the code model, but then, allegations have been made that they have went in and rewrote the code, which has allowed for this backdooring that allows longer hours. And, that's absolutely something that I would love to do a much deeper dive on, because, there's some
Is it
carriers.
are you saying it's a fairly rampant problem?
Yes,
Okay,
in Canada and the US.
right.
And even Canada, in doing, where they had, well, and maybe it was a slower process, as far as, they did have, a different process than the US, where, so many providers were flooding FMCSA with, different, ELDs, but and that fit, what the requirements were. But then by the time that, people started reporting problems with that ELD, a certain ELD, they had already moved on to like a 2.0, or they had changed it slightly. Or, like they were allowed to fix it, and some were legitimate, issues, that were able to fix. But then in other cases, they've just come back as a different name under a different, it's the same people, working behind the scenes, making a different ELD that allows. And I've talked to some sources who say they'll pay more, like, for an ELD, because of, they can work as many hours as they want, rather than sticking to a cheaper, pay by the month subscription or whatever. And, and so, the editing of logs, and, I did an investigation on how, a driver called and said, "Hey, I'm out of hours." They went into the system and they came back and were able to continue driving. It's rampant in the industry.
Right. So since the ELD mandate, on a related note, I just want to know if you have information about this. The FMCSA, especially last year in the the sort of waning days of the Biden administration, the FMCSA has had its own retention problem, where they've had like 20 something administrators over its very short life, since like it used to be the Interstate Chamber of Commerce. Anyway, last year the FMCSA made a lot of noise about increasing the number of trucks subject to the mandate by taking away certain exemptions, right? I think they wanted to lower the model year exemption from 1999 to 1994 or 5 or something. And that implies that they believe that people that were running older trucks with paper logbooks were somehow more involved in safety incidents or collisions. In my own research, trying to find that stuff, I haven't seen any evidence of it, because every time I look into a collision, it's like a newer truck that's got an ELD in it. And I'm like, okay, FMCSA, where is your evidence that people driving older exempt trucks are the problem? Why aren't you focusing on the backdooring of all of these incidents that are happening, that we have evidence for through reporting by wonderful people like Clarissa Hawes? Why aren't you doing that? And why are you trying to punish, grandpa with his like 1993 Peterbilt over here that drives 50 miles an hour and has never gotten an accident? Can you talk to this disconnect?
I read some things on it, and I have my own opinion, but I don't have enough information to support what I think is happening in the industry. But there's some malfeasance going on, and and how that is being manipulated, and I think from my experience, the older trucks, people can work, drivers can work on them. They know their equipment, and a lot of them are just trying to do, operate within the 150 air mile radius these days,
The exemption,
in
yeah.
ag and in other areas. And so it's interesting that there's been a lot of newer ish equipment that I've found that are having issues. So I've read things, but I'm a deep diver, and I haven't dug enough to be able to, I've heard from some sources, but it's going to be an interesting, I think, in next few years on what we see happening in the industry.
Well, that question I just posed you may be a moot point anyway, now that I think about it, because, the Trump administration and their guy, if he is to be believed, their new FMCSA legal counsel, at one of the 3 FMCSA presentations at Matt's, said, we have a deregulatory attitude and a deregulatory approach, and we're not here to like strangle you guys anymore, in a manner of speaking. So maybe that focus on trying to harass the guys with older trucks was a Biden era thing, and now it's different, but who knows? Governments talk out of both sides of their mouth all the time. You've had all this experience at FreightWaves and at LandLine. Are there is there anyone in the trucking media who would have the resources or the gumption or interest to do those deep dives that you think are necessary to find out this more fine grained information, so that like we know more about what's going on?
I think there's a lot of talented journalists in our, in this, medium. It just, it's kind of right now. It's it seems to be a more get as much posted, analytics. Let's get as much, instead of focusing on the deeper dives, that are in the industry. There seems to be a more of a, hey, a one hit wonder, like let's do this, and let's leave this up to somebody else. But I think everybody, there's so many talented journalists in the trucking trade media that absolutely have the chops to take this on. It just, it's, once you do it, it's ingrained in your soul. Like, you don't sleep, you're working. I would take calls at 2 or 3 o'clock, based on different time zones across the world, like to take these calls from sources. And some people think it's a 8 to 5 job or whatever, and it never was for me. And it was always once it's a passion project, and you're determined, you think maybe this will lead to all the ending all the problems in the industry. It's not a job. It's the media is changing on what they want to read, quick hits and sum it up in bullet points and listicles and things like that. And
Right. So as what one writer to another, you've got this long history in investigative journalism, and I wouldn't dare compare what I do to you. You're going hard. You've been doing it a long time. Again, I am merely an opinion merchant, but I have written for a few places, right? Like Newsweek and American Conservative, whatever. There's a few outlets that have asked me to write stuff for them. And one place I used to write that I don't anymore because my editor got let go was Newsweek. And Newsweek is a generalist publication, And no offense to my editor, this is not her fault. She's just responding to these other forces. Man, they play to the attention span thing, like you're saying, quick hits, quick hits. I would send her stuff that was like 1,200, 1,500, 1,600 words, which for an issue to my mind is not nearly enough. Like I could spool off 5,000 words deep dive on trucking related stuff, but like I was always under this pressure to cut it back, cut it back. And it wasn't just Newsweek, like Compact's done that to me. Every editor is like, oh man, you gotta like make it more concise. Sometimes concision and getting to the point are useful, but sometimes when you're like trying to make an argument or you're trying to like build something up so that like you can get some policy change or you can like reveal the truth about something, that takes time, it takes words, it takes study, effort, and length of content. And yeah, let's do listicles, let's do short stuff. Ugh, I hate that shit.
Well, and you can't explain. I think in trucking, you learn, or in the transportation media as a whole, you learn something new every day. And from an outsider trying to explain, they're like, oh, trucking is unsafe, but they don't understand all of the factors that weigh into why some of the issues exist, in the industry. And so, it's just, let's do a listicle on facts, 5 facts. And, and sometimes they're from, skewed sources, like, oh, this many, and so yes, it definitely, it's hard for me to, especially, every acronym that, all transportation is a fan of, and trying to explain the terminology and to go into certain things about the industry. Yes, it's definitely, it takes 1,600 words just to get to the, why, the meat of why this is, occurring, or why an issue it continues to occur, and explaining how the different, organizations are supposed to work together, but maybe don't. And it's frustrating for sure.
So what are you up to now? What's Clarissa doing now as it's going to be May tomorrow, May 2025. I might not release this for a couple weeks yet. I have this huge backlog of podcasts. And I'm also, I'm mining this interview for commentary for my book.
Right.
But May 2025, what's Clarissa up to?
I have a few sources that I'm chatting with for some interesting information that I'm mining through right now, just on my own, and we'll see what comes out of it. I still have a lot of vetting that I need to go through, but there's still a lot of things shaken out, like it's still going to be a crazy, interesting 2025. So I'm working on some independent projects for right now.
Pieces you would be able to sell on a freelance basis.
Yes. Yes. And even I got the goods on a couple of pieces that it's like the holy, I got some good sources that I've known, some I've known for 18 years, that are continuing to share information with me. And so I'm just following the trail, the crumbs, to see where on my own time.
Well, this is it. I mean, to want to do things like you do and what I do, again, it requires that curiosity, right? Like you want to figure out why something is, you want to figure out all the details, you want to know the whole thing so that you've got like a more complete picture. And then you sort of assemble that. And essentially what we're doing is just sharing this knowledge with people by writing it, right?
Right.
If we get paid, that's a small bonus, It would be nice if more of us did. You know what's funny? I was listening to I have this friend who used to work for the CBC in Canada. Her name is Trish Wood. And she hasn't worked for them in a long time. And then she started her own podcast. And but she was around the CBC in the 80s. You know, she was a host for their sort of flagship investigative journalism program called
Right.
The Fifth Estate, which was like the Canadian version of 60 Minutes.
Right.
And, I think she had sent me this article, or she was talking about it on one of her podcasts. There was a article written recently, I think in Vanity Fair magazine, talking about how back in the 80s, like, journalism and investigative journalism and deep dive stuff was like, that was a big deal, and people made a lot of money doing it. And like Vanity Fair would charge, like, to get a full page ad for like Vanity Fair back in the 80s was like $5,000 or something. And like, journalists would get paid tons of money and hang out at all the coolest bars and restaurants in New York City and flown all over the world. And now you almost have to beg, right? And things I've written for people, $250 if I'm lucky, less. I do a lot of stuff for free just for like name recognition, bro. Get your name out there. And it's
Right.
like, well, this is the stuff we're trying to do is valuable to people, but it's somewhere along the way the value got disconnected.
Yes. I would say that's true. Definitely that, it's people, in the age where people of social media, of, having short clips, they want to know everything in 60 seconds, like, and, it's, but, then, I know a lot of my work has been shared, by other outlets, that have, that were able to do that, based on my reporting over the years. And I know they're saying, where are you? Like, hey, like, I kind of counted on you for, like, you know, for my audience. And I'm like, and, but I'm, you know, I I want I want to solve all the things that need solving. That's what's important to me. And I hope someday we get there. I hope the age of, my of investigative journalism is back, instead of just re-reporting what other people have reported, or linking to other people. That's the worst for me. Is like, I don't trust anybody, and no offense, like, I, to my own reporting, I will always, and in some cases you can't, if it's a story and you've had to link, but I always prided myself on trying to, ensure that the accuracy. And I, debunked, others, that they had it and it was wrong. If I would have linked to it, it would have been wrong. And so, but that too is more time consuming. And
Time has a value.
yes, but I'm still not going to be the listicle person and the bullet point, because I think there's value in educating the industry, and for me to be educated. I feel like, you know, in the comments, like on stories, I learned something, all the time. It's like, wow, that's yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, something I didn't know, something I'll look into.
I love hearing from people. I don't hear from them enough, actually. There's a weird thing where I'll post my argument or some article, and everybody gets haters. Um,
Right.
and I've always found that mine just like want to tell me I'm wrong, or there's this one guy on Twitter that always says, "Oh, McGill's not even American." What does my okay, I have a permanent residency card. Yes, I was born and raised in Canada. What does that have to do with the content of what I'm talking about, though? Like, or
Right.
people want to argue with me about like the driver shortage thing. I'm like, well, there's all these CDLs here. I have all these sources. I mean, I'm happy to be corrected if like 3 million of these CDLs are fake and they're making the numbers up and you have proof of that, I'll retract my statement. But they never
Right.
do.
I know. Well, we'll keep continuing to fight. I guess that's all we can do.
Right. Okay, Clarissa, I've kept you here for 90 minutes now. I got to go and pick my kids up from school soon. I imagine you're also busy. Do you have any parting thoughts or ways for people to find you, get a hold of you, track you down on the internet?
Sure. Anybody can find me on Clarissa Hawes at gmail.com. And on Twitter, it's cage_writer, or X, you can find me there. But yes, any thoughts, tips, I'm always welcome to entertain new ideas and theories and thoughts and sources. So
Right. And these independent pieces you alluded to, is there a time frame on those at all? Do you think they'll come out?
it I the one of them that I'm working on is going to take several months, because I'm getting documents, as they, sometimes it's as they come, but, and it's, sometimes by the time I'm looking into them, they've set up a new LLC, they've switched officers and, things like that. But, I'm working on it. It's going to be a few months before, but I'll let you know once I've got something solid.
Right. Yeah. Good things come to those who wait, and nothing good was ever created in a hurry. So,
Right. Well, it was nice chatting with you today.
yeah. Yeah. Thanks very much for joining me, Clarissa. I really appreciate all the info. And, feel free to, if you think there's something additional I should consider for my sort of book, which is a sort of broad examination of the fate of the American truck driver in 2025 and all of the forces arrayed against them over the last couple of decades. By all means, I use your soapbox. Let me know.
Okay. Okay. You take care. Thanks again.
All right, way of the road.